Hello, U.S. history students. I hate to break the news here, but I have been officially diagnosed with COVID-19, and that means that I will not be with you here for the rest of the semester, and that is unfortunate, and I'm sad about it. But like I wrote to you in that note, we're gonna finish strong. We're in really great shape. We just have this last lesson and then a review piece in place. But it is just, I love this material. I'm sad I can't be there with you, but it's good. I definitely don't feel great. My voice feels weak, and so I'm just sort of trying to push through as much as I can with this one video lesson. I do want to tell you that. So we have this lesson 4.8. We'll take care of this right now. The Unit 4 exam assignment is already posted to Google Classroom, so you can begin your work on preparing for that unit exam, and that exam is, of course, next Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. The Unit 4 study guide is on Classroom. It's posted to that exam assignment. A lot of you have paper copies of that already. Just pay attention to that last page. That sort of tells you some important stuff about what to be ready for in terms of your essays. You can email me with questions. I'll be very eager to respond as quickly as I can. So this just is what it is, and I'm working to make the best of it, and I believe you guys are doing that too. And we'll just finish this together, and then in January we'll be together again, and it'll be beautiful. Okay, so let's finish our unit, shall we? The Civil War's legacy. So the last stages of it, and what it means for us. So let's just evaluate for a second here. Here we have Abraham Lincoln having just been reinaugurated. And if the first term of his presidency was all about how do we sort of hold the Union together, Lincoln is sort of thinking ahead to his second term, and there's just really a whole new set of crazy challenges that he's looking ahead to tackle. How do we need to conclude the war? There's just Lee's army is holed up in Petersburg, Virginia. We need to bring this to a close. How can we make sure that Lee doesn't get away? But I think more significantly, even thinking beyond the army of Robert E. Lee, how can we just sort of make sure that the end of the war really is the end of the war and it doesn't just sort of go underground, right? How do we bring these Confederate states that have been in rebellion? What are the rules for bringing them back into the Union? There's no constitutional guidelines here, so we're going to have to create a whole new playbook. How does that happen? What's the fair and equitable way? Do you just at the end of the war say, okay, welcome back Mississippi, you're back in the United States? Or do they have to agree to certain changes? Or do you allow people who had served in the Confederate government to now serve on their state legislatures and all that stuff? Like, what should be the rules? How do we figure that one out? We are going to be freeing slaves. We'll talk about that in a second. Ought we amend the Constitution? What should be the status of all these new freed slaves? What should be done to help these freed slaves? Is it enough to just sort of say, okay, well, you're no longer enslaved, and good luck to you, and, see you later? Like, is that sufficient? Or given the situation and the reality that they faced, or the, historic degree of injustice that they've had sort of pressed upon them, is there some restoration work that's needed in here? Like, what's the right move, right? And if so, how does that get paid for? All these are huge questions. These are not insignificant or small pieces. These are massive questions that Lincoln's getting ready to tackle. A really beautiful thing is happening in this period of time around the time Lincoln's finished, between his re-election and his death. So we're talking early 1865. The Congress gets to work in passing the 13th Amendment. So this will be an amendment to the Constitution, and it's as big as any amendment in the Constitution. It reads very simply, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." No more slavery. No more slavery. Slavery is gone, and it's going to be carved into the Constitution. Agreed to by 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. So all the northern states are voting for this. They're getting several of the border states agreed to vote for it. And so that's going to be enough to get that. This amendment would be ratified in December 1865. Glory, hallelujah. This change that was just unimaginable for a long time now is happening. Right, the chains have been broken, and it's not. The Emancipation Proclamation was an act of war. So once the war is over, the Emancipation Proclamation is sort of no longer in place. But this constitutional amendment, this is, as we've learned, as permanent as we can make it, and that's just going to be the end of that, right? And they're going to have to swallow that slavery is gone. Praise Jesus for that. Speaking of Jesus, Lincoln gives this profound speech at the very end of his life, a week before his death, his second inaugural address. It's basically a theological speech. The tone of the speech is almost like someone who's gone through dark, dark, dark grief and is emerging out of the back end of it. And it's not like they are hunky-dory and happy, but they're sort of saying, I'm coming to understand what might be going on here, or what this is about, or I'm coming to a place of acceptance in this. It's extremely powerful. Let me just read you an excerpt from the second inaugural address here. Again, where Lincoln is just sort of giving his assessment of here's what this war has been. And again, just sort of sharing with the country, holding up for the country a mirror, like this is how I understand what we've gone through. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, so like when he was first inaugurated, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let the nation perish, and the war came. So notice Lincoln's kind of fatalistic language here. The war came, right? But he's saying our side, we made war rather than let the nation perish. The other side would make war rather than let the nation survive. Like we fought to keep our nation intact. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and a powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. So Lincoln's saying, we all understood what the cause of this war was, right? We all understood it. Somehow we all understood that slavery was the cause of this conflict. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. So no one thought it was going to be this bad. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. So he's like, no one thought that like slavery would be on its way out the door even before the war is over, right? And that's sort of a note of hope here. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge, that's a whip, of war may speedily pass away. And yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman, that's the slave owner, all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago in the Bible, so it still must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Guys, right here, this is a powerful idea, right? He's saying if it's God's will that like 250 years of every dime that our American colonists and the people of the United States made off the backs of slaves, all of every dime and every piece of wealth we gain from that will be sunk and destroyed by war, then that's God's judgment, right? And he's saying this war is God's judgment. God's judgment for what? For slavery. Lincoln says the United States of America has been taken out behind the woodshed and administered a consequence like no one had ever conceived of for the sin of slavery. This is the President of the United States sort of saying, come to repentance. We must come to repentance for what we have done. And like he's envisioning a very Old Testament vision of God. It's powerful. Just imagine a president coming out and saying, like, we if we haven't repented yet, it's time, because our God is interested in justice and he's extracting that price right now. And then he finishes on this optimistic tone: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This is beautiful stuff. Boy, what a benediction for a country, right? And it's sort of spoken with humility, like firmness in the right as much as we can understand the right, and we need God to understand what is right. Let's push on toward justice. And how do we do that? By healing and by restoring and caring for widows and orphans and veterans. What a vision to cast at the end of his life. And I'm sad to say it was the end of his life. We'll get there in a second. A couple days after inauguration, the war comes to a close. Robert E. Lee attempts to slip out of Petersburg, Virginia. Grant is anticipating this. Grant corners him. Grant is on his tail again. Lee recognizes he just doesn't have a move left. Right? Now, Jefferson Davis has told Robert E. Lee, fight on, fight on, fight on, never give up, like carry on the fight, keep fighting, keep fighting. Lee just recognizes this is destructive. At this point, this is so damaging. I don't have a move left. The war is lost. And to just sort of fight on forever creates sort of like exponentially more damage, right? And if we signal to our people, never, never, never give up, right? Or like we must carry on the fight forever, like there will just never be healing that can take place. At some point, you just say, we lost. And Lee is man enough and clear-eyed enough to do that. Lee puts out peace feelers to Grant. Grant and Lee meet at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. It's not a special place, it's just where they happen to be. So at Appomattox Courthouse is where the peace terms are signed. Grant is very generous. And Grant tells his own men, his quote was, "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again." Like on that day, he's sort of beginning this process of reconciliation. And he orders that the Union Army share its food and provisions with the Confederate Army on that day. Like the actions of national reconciliation and restoration begin not by some act of Congress, but through the actions of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. We should be grateful that Robert E. Lee chose to surrender as opposed to following Jefferson Davis's orders to fight on. And Grant's decision to offer generous terms in victory also set a key precedent that the way forward is surrender and generosity. That's our way forward here. A somber, I don't know about beautiful moment, but a somber moment and a good moment in our story. And then just a couple days after that, so everything's happening so fast, right? Between Lincoln's reinauguration and his death is about a week. There's Appomattox Courthouse happens in between. Lincoln is killed on Good Friday, 1865, right before Easter. He's assassinated by an actor named John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is a Confederate sympathizing actor who is a narcissist and a megalomaniac and who somehow believed he can sort of reignite or respark the Southern resistance. His plan doesn't really make any sense. He is these sort of people, he's collected a group of hangers-on who are fools and half-crazy people, and they had this whole plan to kidnap Lincoln, and then that didn't work, and so then it's like, well, we're going to kill Lincoln, we'll kill Lincoln, and we'll kill Vice President Johnson, and we'll kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, and all these, we'll sort of cut the head off the whole Union government, and that doesn't really happen like that, except, Booth is able to assassinate Lincoln while he's, of course, sitting and attending a play. Booth escapes for a week or two, and he writes. He's a diary. You can read John Wilkes Booth's diary entry from the last weeks of his life. It's maddening because he considers himself the hero, and why isn't the South rising up to defend me, and someday everyone will thank me for this. Basically, is his tone right up to the end, and he's eventually rounded up and shot. Escaped. He's caught in a tobacco barn in Virginia, and he's killed. And it's just a calamity. It's an absolute calamity for the country that there was someone at this crucial moment. There was a president who perhaps had the kind of vision and wisdom to guide us through that, and to lose him at that moment is really catastrophic for the country. And this post-war period is going to become so messy, in large part because the man who is president, Andrew Johnson, is a joke. And we'll learn about that in January when we're back together. So this is just sort of one more sad component to the end of the war. All right, well, let's take a step back and just consider all this. When we're assessing, I mean, a good question to start with is like, so the North won the war, the Union won the war. How did that happen? And if you're analyzing, it's not too hard. All right, I think you students could do this. I could put these factors in front of you. Could you just annotate this? I think you could. You could turn these in bullet points for an essay, right? And you could write about this. The Union had all kinds of material advantages and population advantages. They had those right from the outset. And in some ways, that was always going to be key, especially once they had someone like Ulysses S. Grant who could really leverage those advantages, right? And Abraham Lincoln, his leadership is superior. It's just sort of like it's really unmatched during the war, and the way he's able to sort of like move the ball down the field, as we've said over and over again, in terms of the war strategy, executing the war strategy, but also just in terms of the moral strategy of the approach to slavery. So like leadership, material population advantages, that's also big. The Confederacy was never able to get international help from Great Britain. That would have made an enormous difference. They weren't able to get that, all right? Again, because Lincoln partly cut them off with the Emancipation Proclamation, and also because they'd overproduced cotton in the 1850s, and Britain wasn't in desperate need of cotton at that moment. And let's also throw in just, after the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a surge of new enlistments and new energy from African Americans and abolitionists, and sort of at that midway point in the war, that plays a huge part in sort of turning the tide. And if you're looking at this, you'd say in the early days of the war, the South had a shot. They really did have a shot, maybe more of a shot than they had any right to. But they had a shot. But in the end, the Union was able to close that out because they could, leverage their advantages. And you're looking at positive effects of the war. You just have to begin with slavery's finally over, right? And some 4 million people are freed from bondage thanks to the efforts of the United States Army and Abraham Lincoln, right, and everyone else. So like that's an enormous advantage. So the U.S. paid a higher cost in the Civil War than it's ever paid for anything. But the benefit here, the removal of that cancer of slavery, is significant. Like you guys know what's coming up, though. You know that the end of slavery, this freedom, is not a fully delivered promise, and we'll look at that at the start of semester 2. Like there's that creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and then back into the fall. We'll see that lived out for sure. It is established. No one leaves the United States. All right, the Union is perpetual, and the federal government has primacy over the state governments, and that's just the end of that. That's sort of like definitively settled. And I think it's also interesting that the sectional differences, they don't immediately fade away, but I'd say within 10, 15 years, the deeply entrenched sectional differences between North and South begin to diminish. And in a weird way, the memories of the Civil War actually kind of unify and pull Americans together more than it separates them. And Northerners, Northerners and Southerners can sort of recall what happened there, and they tend to recall it as something that they went through together, rather than something that the other side did to them in a weird way. And people begin to conceive of the United States less and less as a collection of states, and more as a single political entity made up of a number of different states. I don't want to overstate this, but it's quite remarkable that today, the Civil War, which is like a sectional struggle that seemed to pull us apart. Memories of the Civil War are something that holds Americans together. And that's a really positive thing. We need that because we are people who sometimes pull ourselves apart. So like the things that pull us together are really essential, and they're worth having history classes tell and retell this, or watch movies about it. Negative effects. Well, you just begin with the human cost, 750,000 dead, countless more maimed and disfigured. That's an enormous cost here. The economic costs in the South are just incalculable. You know, what cities they had are destroyed, rail lines they had destroyed, just systematically destroyed, not accidentally destroyed, not like, oh, sorry, we missed. It's like, no, that was the whole point. The point was we were destroying your economy, and now we're going to have to begin rebuilding it, right? Our estimates would be about 2/3 of the wealth of the South. And the South is not a poor place, but 2/3 of the wealth of the South has been destroyed by the war. And so we're going to have to begin this process of rebuilding. And for Southerners themselves, there's just this disorienting. Everything that we kind of believed about ourselves has been ripped apart. Every narrative that we believed about ourselves in the North, we have lost. Like, we now lost to those people. And not only did we lose to those people, but like they're looking at us in some ways with the slavery thing, like we caused this, or we were wrong. And were we wrong? And what do we make of this? And for Southerners to internalize what happened is hard, and I would say it isn't a fully successful process. I'm going to leave us on this unresolved note here. If there were people who were saying, we're just waiting, I'm going to be happy when this war is over, so we can read some account of Southerners saying, you know what? We're really sorry about the slavery thing. That was really wrong, and we should never have gone we should never listen to John C. Calhoun like that, and we will never do that again. If people were waiting for that comeuppance or that reckoning, that never really happened. Instead, what sort of settled in across the South in the generation or so following the war is a kind of a mythologized version of what the war was about. And the term we use is, we call it the lost cause myth. And the lost cause mythos said that, you know, the Civil War was a complicated thing, and it wasn't really about slavery. It was about us fighting to preserve our Southern culture and way of life. And our Southern culture and way of life isn't really defined by slavery. It was about our sort of courtly, genteel, a little more slower moving, aristocratic way of life, right? And it was just different. The Northerners and these Yankees have always had factories and the hustle and bustle and the fast movement and lots of immigrants and lots of people seeking the almighty dollar. And we've always just sort of had something a little different down here. And we wanted to fight to preserve that. And yes, there was slavery. That was a part of it. But slavery, you know, they kind of whitewashed slavery. Slavery wasn't really that bad, right? Slaves were kind of treated like family members in many ways. And I don't know, maybe in some ways slavery was kind of natural. And maybe it was a little more natural and normal than trying to pretend that everybody's the same and sort of use weird language like that. And so, and this mythos, you know, that developed, it's just easier to swallow from a Southern perspective, you know, because then it's like, you know what? And we gave it our best shot. We fought heroically, man. We gave them hell. We almost won, but we didn't. And in the end, the North won, and they imposed some changes. And maybe some of the changes are all right, but, you know, we did lose something beautiful and essential in that war. And that's just like an easier pill to swallow, because you don't have to admit that what was at the center of this thing was a grave injustice that you were propagating, right? Instead, it's like you kind of say, well, you know, let's let bygones be bygones. And we had something pretty special back then in this sort of antebellum South, this pre-war South. And that really just holds on for a long time. And, you know, it gets kind of taught and retaught in Southern schools for generations. And I don't know if there's a lot of people still holding on to it. You can find it. You can find people who will defend the Confederacy and say they're kind of defending, that was a war to preserve and defend Southern heritage, instead of saying, well, the Southerners at the time and the Confederate leaders said this is all about slavery and white supremacy, so maybe we should just listen to them instead of like this weird made-up story that you're coming up with after the fact, right? This lost cause myth has a way of like trying to avoid God's withering glare, trying to say, no, that it wasn't about that thing. It wasn't about that thing. It was about something else instead. And you can try to obfuscate and throw that up in the air and cloud the issue, but I don't know if that will last. So we're going to finish here. Your work now is to do this reflective work in the Unit 4 scrapbook. That's always a good way to finish this. Please email me if questions pop up. And again, I'm sorry I can't be there today. And I look forward to when I can be with you guys again in the new year. Take care, guys.